Just thank you to everybody for making the climb up to the top floor. So, quick introduction for those of you who haven't met me before. So, I work at Astun Technology. I provide coding support, training, wide range of open source programs. And then in my spare time, I'm one of the guys who's mean to you on GIS Stack Exchange and complains about the quality of your questions. I'm also a regular contributor to GeoTools and GeoServer. If you want a copy of the slides, you can download them. I will provide that QR code again at the end for anybody who missed it. Okay. Just wait till I see some of the cameras go down. Okay, so the problem statement we had. So this was a customer came to us, described their problem to our sales team, who said, yes, of course we'll do that, and then came and asked us if we could do it, which is the way our sales team normally works. So the idea was we should provide a single login for QGis users to WMS layers from GeoServer, possibly WFS layers. They weren't sure. They're not sure they need that yet. And direct access to the PostGIS database. So they've got a centralized data store. They needed to be able to restrict access for different data sets to some specific users, either by team or by specific user. They wanted a simple graphical user interface for their administration team. And it had to make use of their existing Azure Active Directory. That was where it really went downhill as far as we were concerned. But there we go. Can't argue with the customer. So single sign-on has a multitude of meanings depending on who you talk to. In this talk, I'm going to mean it as a session user authentication service. Permits a user with one set of credentials, for example, a username and password, to access multiple applications. And we're going to do that by providing a federated identity system, which is really what Active Directory is. For all that Microsoft would like to tell you, it's something really clever and special. It is just a federated identity system. So, to implement this, we sort of poked our heads a bit, scratched our heads a bit, poked around. And comes down to it, when you poke Active Directory hard enough, it turns out just to be an LDAP implementation. And both GeoServer and PostGIS can make use of LDAP pretty much out of the box. You have to do some configuration, but it's easy. So you use LDAP, an LDAP server to provide your central store of identities. GeoServer and PostGIS effectively pass a username and password back to that service, and it passes back a yes, they're acceptable, or no, they're not acceptable message. Obviously, it's a little more complicated than that behind the scenes, but that's close enough. So, as I say, GeoServer has a built-in LDAP authentication provider. It's not even an extension. It comes with all installs of GeoServer. You can configure your users and groups for authorization purposes. And you can configure those rules then as the same as any other custom authentication system that you have installed. So it looks to your GeoServer administrator just as if they're normal GeoServer users and they've got normal GeoServer roles. PostGIS, it gets a little bit trickier. So again, it's a quote from the manual, and the bits I've bolded are the important bits. So LDAP is only used to validate your username and password pairs. Therefore, the user must already exist in the database. And that turns out to be a bit tricky. So you can verify that they're entitled to log into your data set, but unless you've created a role that matches that name, they won't actually get to do anything once they've logged on. I'll talk about how we get around that in a minute, but that's an important thing to bear in mind, that PostGIS is trickier than GeoServer. So when it comes to actually setting it up, you just modify a line in your PGHBA, your host-based access conf file. It goes in this, instead of saying peer or MD5 or trust in that last column, you put some magic LDAP squiggles, and away it goes. So we drew a system diagram. So basically we've got actual users in the top. You're using QGis. and want to connect to GeoServer and PostGIS, and don't want to have to remember multiple different passwords. And over on this side, we've got an administrator looking after our Azure Active Directory, and we've got GeoServer and PostGIS coming over here and authenticating against it. And this all sounded fine. We thought this was, all going to work. At which point we had to do a small pivot. The corporate IT team informed the GIS team that there was no way they were messing with the Active Directory service. Which you can kind of see the IT team's point, but it would have been much better if they'd told us that at the beginning rather than when we were 3 weeks into the project. So we went back to the drawing board. Could we replace this really expensive piece of Microsoft code that the customer was paying thousands a month for, I think, with some open source tools? And obviously, the answer is yes, we can. We can install an open LDAP server, for example. There are multiple LDAP servers out there, but Open LDAP is quite an easy one to use. So it's a complete LDAP service. The only difference is that it doesn't have Microsoft's name on it and it doesn't run on Azure. Both of which were wins as far as I was concerned. So that you can import users and groups if you've got the right format, and you can convince Active Directory it wants to export things in the right format for you. And it comes pre-Dockerized even, so it's really easy to install. You just download the Docker image and run it. And this is how you add users to it. You produce an LDIF file, and you run LDAP add -x -w -d yada 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 yada. So that was all right. However, you remember one of my first requirements was there had to be a nice GUI for the administrators. As I say, these are GIS experts, they're not IT experts. They don't want to be messing around with Vim and cat and LDAP add. So command line interfaces and Python scripts were out apparently. So we deployed Keycloak to manage the human to LDAP interactions, which is another open source tool. Basically can be used to provide all your identity provider needs. You can do OAuth and things, and you can do your web access and things as well. But we use it very simply as just an interface, as a front end to our LDAP service. GeoServer actually has a Keycloak extension that will talk directly to it. Though somebody was telling me they're dropping that as a separate authentication method now. PostGIS doesn't want to talk to Keycloak at all, but that's fine because we can use it with Open LDAP. Again, this one comes pre-Dockerized with its own little Postgres server inside the Docker containers, so you can hide all of your complicated security stuff away inside a Docker set of Docker containers, and it all works nicely. So that's our new system diagram. It's basically the same, except instead of having Microsoft Azure Active Directory on this side, I've got another AWS EC2 instance running Keycloak, Open LDAP, Postgres, and LDAP PHP just for debugging purposes, because it turns out Open LDAP is trickier to debug than you might think. So if you want to set up Keycloak administration, it's a lovely GUI that it provides. It's all web-based, and it's basically tabs. There's a nice menu down the side. You set up stuff like the emails, who's sending emails. Little in there that I'm using MailHog. Anybody who ever tries to set up anything that has to send out emails to users, I highly recommend MailHog because it pretends to be an SMTP server for you. So you can check that your email's working without having to actually use a proper service, and actually, all of the trouble you get into authenticating yourself with the user service. So it's well worth it for testing purposes. That's how you would connect to an LDAP server. Basically, you just say, what's the connection URL to my LDAP server? How do you log on? What's the admin password, or whatever the viewer password? There's lots of test buttons, so you can test whether you can connect to it. You can test whether you can authenticate, that sort of thing. You specify at the bottom how you want LDAP to interact. So you want it to be writable, or you can set it as read-only, but as I say, we were using this as our front end. You specify how your users in LDAP are separated, what sort of objects they are, that sort of thing. And then there's a little bit of messing around. You have to configure a series of rules that create mappings between Keycloak and LDAP, because obviously you wouldn't all want to use the same names. So it's things like Keycloak calls your surname last name and LDAP calls it SN, and things like that. So you just specify some mappings. There's quite a lot of them come predefined, but you can set up other custom ones as you need. You create your groups and user organizations in LDAP. This is what I was using PHP LDAP for, because it's easier to work out what's going on. You have to actually create the groups. Again, you can create your groups in Keycloak, or you can create them directly into LDAP, which is what I did because it's quicker that way. I can script it, but as they add future groups, the admins will be able to do that through Keycloak. And then you can create users directly from Keycloak. So you type a username in, you give the email address, first name, last name. You can then have required actions. I don't think you'll be able to read that screen, but that says the first thing they have to do is update their password. And that will trigger Keycloak into sending them an email saying the admin has set this account up and said you need to change your password. And it will then prompt them to go to Keycloak and set a password on their account. You can also add them into groups down there, depending on what data sets you think they should be able to look at later. That's a user in LDAP. I set up a completely separate thing so I wouldn't give away the client's identity, and then realized that all the users had their identity in the email and things. So, but basically, for anybody who's really interested, you model these as there's a stack of types. So person followed by internet organization, person followed by organizational person. It's just LDAP's way of composing various templates together to make a sensible object. In GeoServer, as I say, there's an LDAP authentication provider, which you can specify. And then there's a variety of things you have to fill in and some that are optional. So you can specify how you get the groups, who's the admin, which groups should be given admin privileges, that sort of thing. You also have to configure the authentication provider. And then you have to set up a role provider. So that's saying take the users from LDAP, make them into roles on GeoServer. Again, you specify a variety of things. Groups, again, you specify the group service. It's, again, you now, instead of telling it how to extract users from LDAP, you tell it how to extract the groups from LDAP and how you work out which users are in which group. That magically then imports all your LDAP groups for you into GeoServer. You may not or may not have been able to read earlier on, I had created these groups. Energy, forestry, rural, sales and letting. You may be able to guess what the client does. Don't forget to make the role service active. I have to confess I lost quite a lot of time trying to work out why I couldn't get GeoServer to actually use the role setting I'd set up. I have now updated the documentation to make it much clearer that when you finish you have to go back to the beginning and change this setting. And then, if anybody's a GeoServer admin, they'll know how this works. You've got all of your roles down here. So I've got forestry roles or energy roles, and I can then give them access to different workspaces and such like as usual. PostGIS. It's a bit trickier, as I said earlier. You have to have the users pre-created in the PostGIS database before they can log on. So I use a program I found called LDAP Sync that basically I run with a cron job every minute. And it says, okay, look at the LDAP get me a list of users. Look at PostGIS, get me a list of users. Any that aren't in that list, move them over to there. Any that are in this list but not there, delete them. So there's a little bit, you specify how to do groups and users. As I say, whack it into a cron job. And it turns out, whether we were worried there might be a risk of people getting their username and trying to log into PostGIS inside that first minute, but it turns out that setting your password limit is actually sufficiently complex that nobody's managed to do it in less than a minute and get to PostGIS. That's just some of the things you'll see in the log file. Here's how you convince Postgres that it wants to trust LDAP. So you say where its server is, what the binding address is, so effectively who's the user that you should use to log in, and what a base user is. And basically at that point you can then log in using PSQL or QGis or whatever your preferred PostGIS client is in exactly the same way as you would normally. Yeah, the only other tricky bit on that was I had to remember to set SSL mode equals require because we turned on encryption on the PostGIS database. QGIS has a checkbox for that. PSQL, you have to remember to add it in as an extra. So, problems that we ran into, apart from the clients changing their mind halfway through the project. Email authentication, it's a nightmare. Amazon are so worried that we're going to use one of their mail servers to spam the entire world that you have to verify who you're going to send mail to when you're in test mode. So half of your email tests fail because you forgot to verify that user. And then when we went live and started sending stuff out, Microsoft Outlook, which the client uses because they're Microsoft people, kept flagging these emails up as phishing attempts. And to be honest, they look a lot like a phishing attempt. But the problem was because we set them as coming from within the client's domain, but they were actually coming from outside. And in the end, if anybody knows how to convince Outlook to accept that sort of mail, we'd love to know. In the end, we just changed it to sending the emails from our address. And it was happy with that. We wrote some custom Keycloak event triggers, so we can send out customized emails based on some of the Keycloak transitions. That's not as easy as the documentation makes it sound. But I'll write that up and I might try and put that into their documentation at some point. And the only other problem we had was the fact that they suddenly wanted to import 400 or 500 users to start with. So I wrote a Python script to churn out some text files for that. But it was remarkably easy apart from those things. So, conclude, perfectly possible to do single sign-on for QGIS users to GeoServer and PostGIS. If you need to give non-technical users access to an LDAP server, Keycloak is the way to go. Okay. And there's the slide link again.